Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show in Ukraine, where a man who played a president on television is now preparing to take on the role in real life. Volodymyr Zelensky defeated the incumbent president, Petro Poroshenko, with more than 70% of Sunday's runoff vote. He will take the reins of a country that's facing a lot of challenges. Take a look.
He won by a landslide. Volodymyr Zelensky, a popular comic actor with no previous government experience, has a new role to play for the Ukrainian people. He will now be their president. And Ukraine has a lot of challenges ahead. Many Ukrainians feel that the military standoff with Russia in the east of the country is one of the most important issues they face.
I
think when the war stops, everything will improve. The country can develop when there is a war.
On the eve of his victory, Zelensky pledged that he would wage an information war to stop the hostilities in Donbass, but gave no further details.
Sociology shows that the war is the main problem, and the president will have to give promises and make decisions that society will or will not support.
Some Ukrainians fear Zelensky's political inexperience will be no match to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
I think he will start falling on his knees in front of Putin, telling him to take Donbass, take Crimea, just don't make war in Ukraine. This threat currently exists, that we can lose part of our country.
To address the country's long-standing corruption concerns, Zelensky says he will overhaul law enforcement and strip lawmakers and judges of legal immunity. The country's economy is also struggling. Taxes and utilities are high, while salaries and pensions are low. Zelensky plans to do what is needed to maintain economic stability and stay on course with Ukraine's IMF program. Yet the most pressing challenge for Zelensky is the government itself. The country's parliament is divided, and without a strong coalition partner, Zelensky will face a difficult time getting changes approved.
I believe
Zelensky will succeed, but I don't think he'll be able to do anything before the end of summer with the current parliament. He needs his own team to support his ideas.
Parliamentary elections take place in October, but there's no guarantee a more Zelensky-favorable outcome will emerge.
For more on the Ukrainian election in Moscow, we invited Mark Sloboda, an international relations and security analyst. And also in our Beijing studio, we have Einar Tangen, a CGTN political commentator. I want to welcome both of you. Later, we hope we're also going to talk to a scholar from Kiev. For now, let me go to you first, Mr. Tangen, about the 70% lead, the current candidate likely to be president over the incumbent one. What does it say?
Well, it says the Ukrainians were tired with the status quo. 5 years ago, Poroshenko was swept into power on this idea that he was going to create change, that he was going to reform the system, get rid of all of the corruption, and obviously the Ukrainian people do not think that he did it. And basically, 74% said, in essence, anything but the status quo.
Would you understand the same way, Mr. Sloboda, from Moscow?
Yes, I agree completely. This was a complete repudiation of the West-backed Maidan Putsch that brought the corrupt oligarch Poroshenko to power 5 years ago. He ran a campaign, a nationalist campaign on the themes of militarism, army, language, meaning just one language for Ukraine and one faith, one church, an independent Ukrainian church. And the Ukrainian people responded by saying, that's not what we want. That's not our interest. We're concerned about bread and butter issues. We're concerned that we are the poorest country in Europe, GDP per capita. Ukrainians are poorer than Moldovans after the last 5 years. And they're concerned about high utility prices mandated by IMF and EU association agreement neoliberal shock therapy reforms. The Ukrainian people rejected all of this and said, we want nothing to do with the prior political establishment. we're going to take someone who has no political experience and they hope no corruption as well and hope for the best.
We hope we'll be able to talk to those scholars coming from Kiev later in our show. We are trying our best to reach them. But what exactly are the situation, economically speaking, in Kiev and in Ukraine? What were the conditions if that propelled the comedian turned the politician to the presidency? Take a look at these numbers. Ukraine has a GDP per capita of $9,283, lowest in Europe. Just 9% of Ukrainians have confidence in their government, the lowest level in the world so far. And Ukraine is rife with corruption, some say, ranked about 120th in the world by the Corruption Perception Index. So that is the reality. But another thing people have to think about, Mr. Tangen, I know you are coming originally from the United States, but rather have a very liberal view of this. Mr. Tangen, even though he is coming into power, what can he really do?
Well, as I said earlier, he's not going to have a parliamentary majority, so it's quite difficult to see how he's done. Also, he's hampered by the fact that he has really no experience. He's coming into this situation completely blind. The few times that he has engaged in substantive talks, they have not been impressive. So he's going to have to go through a very quick learning curve, and he's going to have to find the people who can actually implement something. He has a lot of pressure. Some of them are unrealistic. About almost 40% of the people in Ukraine believe that he can somehow affect the utility prices, and that's not really something the government can do unless they start giving subsidies, and the government is not in a position to do that.
And of course, as a result of this, the role of Russia and Moscow is of some significance. Mr. Sloboda, since you are based in Moscow, help us understand this. According to the Kremlin, it is having certain hope for this new president in Ukraine. The earlier relationship between Kiev and Moscow is well known to the rest of the world. Moscow wants it to be, quote unquote, making sound judgment, pragmatism, and also honesty, quote unquote. Exactly to your ears, Mr. Sloboda, what exactly does Russia mean?
Yeah, well, Ukraine is facing a lot of problems because it is still involved in a civil conflict in East Ukraine after the people of Donbass rose up, not accepting the seizure of power of the West-backed Maidan Putsch that brought Poroshenko to power 5 years ago. And the conflict continues to this day with the people of Donbass, and kind of a right to protect mode are supported to some degree at least, particularly with humanitarian aid, but lately also with funding and arms from Moscow. The polls give indication that the people want this conflict to come to an end, and Zelensky certainly hinted towards that, but he gave no clear indication of how he would get there. When Poroshenko was elected, he was also seen by many people that he would bring an end to the conflict in Donbass. In fact, he promised to do so within 24 hours at one point, but instead he escalated it. That proved disastrous in the frozen conflict that we have 5 years today. Russia would like to believe that Zelensky intends to reconcile with the people of East Ukraine, but he's already given every indication that he does not intend to fulfill the Minsk Accords that were agreed upon by the previous Ukrainian government and its European interlocutors, but have never been acted upon. He doesn't want to meet with the authorities in East Ukraine, and that's going to be problematic. And therefore, Russia probably is going to give him a time period to prove that he's honest about improving relations. Even after the last 5 years of conflict and sanctions, Russia is still Ukraine's biggest trade partner. And that's simply a geoeconomic fact. You can't have a prosperous Ukraine that is hostile to, well, half of its own country and Russia as well. It's simply not a formula for success.
Well, from your perspective, Mr. Tangen, the Russia's role, at this moment, Russia is still banning export of energy and oil to Ukraine, and of course that's a big problem for the latter country. Meanwhile, Ukraine is working very hard in the Poroshenko administration to have much closer relationship with the EU, to become a member of the EU, and also, of course, to the West, particularly to the United States. So, Mr. Tangen, when the new president comes into power with such a winning, shall I say, with such a victory, when you look at the polls, can he have much strength in turning the geopolitics the way he wants?
Well, a lot will depend on what happens in October. I mean, during this meantime, I mean, politicians generally will fall into line with what they think the people want. This is an overwhelming majority when you get that kind of those kinds of numbers, and perhaps they will try to do it. But you know, one of the first things he's done is he wants to remove the idea that you cannot be prosecuted while you are actually in the Duma. And this may not be very, very popular with the members of parliament, because they've seen this as a long-held and cherished right to not be hassled while they're in office. So from that perspective, I don't know that he's going to be mending any fences there. He's also been going after the military and the government for corruption. This is something that 32% of the people in Ukraine want. In terms of Russia, you know, there's much to be said on the other side as well. I mean, both Europe and America have an agreement that this is not a situation that is one-sided, that Moscow is right and everyone else is wrong.
It's rather complicated relationship. Now, Poroshenko, of course, has been played very strongly toward the West during his administration. And with the latest polls, it seems to suggest that the people do not necessarily in favor of that 100%, to say the least. Mr. Sloboda, now, Russia also has an opportunity when a new president of Ukraine comes into power. So what could be some of the goodwill gestures coming from Moscow toward the new president and give him a consensus, an opportunity to work with Moscow on a closer basis than his predecessor?
Yeah, just a quick correction. The Ukrainian parliament that was referred to earlier, it's the Rada, not the Duma. The Duma is the Russian parliament. I think the Russian government would be well favored to be open to some kind of gesture, a goodwill gesture in the beginning. One issue that is a question is prisoners on both sides due to multiple incidents in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Ukraine is holding a number of Russian sailors and Russia is holding a number of Ukrainian sailors, a deal by which those sailors, both civil and military, are returned on both sides, and some type of return to operating under existing agreements for transit through the Sea of Azov, an agreement on both sides about how that can be done, and relations restored there would be good as well. And sanctions. You know, Ukraine sanctions on Russia are really only hurting their own economy, and Russia has put counter sanctions on Ukraine as well. Getting rid of those would at least provide a small amount of economic relief for the people of Ukraine. Other than that, I think kind of the first gestures have to be to see how the new Ukrainian president, how he deals internally, how does he get support in parliament? Does he try to call for snap elections? Does his party do well? And how he tries to settle things with his own people in Donbass in the East Ukraine. Does he resort to militarism, or does he try to sit down and talk with them and politically reconcile and heal the wounds that were created by the Maidan Putsch and the conflict that has endured for the last 5 years? He's got to heal those wounds to bring East and West Ukraine together.
Mr. Tangen, now, it's not the president that would be able to do everything. One has to understand that. There is a political framework and political opportunities for one president to choose one direction or the other, given the current political environment in his country. So what about the other players that have been dealing with Ukraine on a frequent basis. For example, the European Union, for example, the United States, in their tug of war with Russia, how this proxy battleground of Ukraine is likely to be defined for the near future?
Well, this is the difficulty. When you have foreign powers going in and interfering on the internal matters of countries, it becomes literally a proxy war, and this is the difficulty. Ukraine cannot walk away from the EU or the US. The US supplies a lot of their military hardware unless they take a very different stance in terms of what they're going to do with Russia. But more importantly, the EU is a lifeline in terms of their economics. They are getting subsidies. They're applying for loans. They're in a very, very desperate situation, as we've already talked about on a per-person basis. So they're not in a position to just say, oh, yes, give in to whatever Russia wants. Russia's not in a position to help them. So at this point, he's got to come up with some new ideas. And the difficulty here is that he's not somebody who has a lot of experience. Now, everyone says he's a comic, but he was trained as a lawyer. He's a successful businessman. He is a millionaire. There are questions, though, about his ties to Komalarov, who is a billionaire who lives outside. He lives in Israel and has been indicted for different types of financial irregularities and basically has not come back.
Well, those are certainly some of the issues that they have to figure out and come public with, I guess, later during the presidency. But, you know, some of the most immediate thing, the poverty inside the country. As we mentioned earlier, it is the last when it comes to the list of the European wealth. And the urgent need for utility, energy inside the country. Now, when you have a change of administration, one administration going out will certainly say, oh, I will do my best. But whether the transition will be smooth or not, that's still a big question mark. Mr. Sloboda, your assessment.
Yeah, they're facing a lot of problems there, and Zelensky doesn't have a lot of power at the moment. The Ukrainian government has basically been propped up by IMF loans, which are going to start coming due in the near future. Promised European investment, U.S. investment in Ukraine hasn't materialized at all, and there's no indication that that is going to change in the near future. On top of it, Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Germany is going to come online at the end of this year, and that's going to cut out gas transit fees, which are a very significant chunk of the Ukrainian economy. So they're going to be facing a very bad situation. With the IMF essentially ruling the country and dictating internal gas prices, he's not in a room to offer the Ukrainian people relief that way.
Right.
Also, the EU Association Agreement and the IMF are demanding privatizations of state companies. That's going to mean millions of unemployed people in Ukraine. At least in the short to medium term, and that's going to bring a lot of economic damage, and I don't think he's going to be able to provide the economic miracle that the Ukrainian people, you know, are hoping for.
But on the other hand, Mr. Tangen, if we look at it philosophically, every challenge could be also an opportunity, particularly when you have a new politician in office. He could take great advantage of the difficulties and turn it around and rally the country if he is smart enough politically and if circumstances permit it to happen. So, Mr. Tangen, about the immediate poverty, about the immediate economic problems, and about the immediate geopolitical challenges the new president has to handle, what do you think he needs to have in hand?
Well, he has to make a determination in the war. The war is the most costly effort that they're going. It's taking resources away from everything that you just talked about. So he has to solve that. And if that means coming to terms with Russia, so be it. But at the same time, he has to keep some sort of balance with the EU. As said, his economic sustaining power right now, anything that he's going to need to rebuild Ukraine is going to probably have to come from the West. There's just only so much that Russia can do. Russia's under a lot of pressure at the moment as well.
What about from the United States?
I don't think there's much chance that there will be economic aid from the United States. Donald Trump is not in a very giving mood these days. He's more about making America great again, which means taking.
So as complicated as the situation is, what would that mean for the region, Mr. Sloboda? I mean, that's also a very crucial question about the peace particularly. Now, this new president has been talking about abiding by the so-called Minsk agreement, despite of some of the commentaries suggesting otherwise. But we haven't seen this president in action yet. So how do you think people would have a better judgment of who he is, what he wants, how capable he is, given by the first few steps he can take? What do you say could be some of those steps? Sir, briefly.
Yeah, the first step would be to sit down with the people of Donbass and politically reconcile. The only problem with that is that there are a number of Ukrainian ultra-nationalist battalions that helped bring the last government to power and pursued the war against Donbass. These are Banderite fascists, quite literally. We're talking about Azov, C-14, the Right Sector, and
briefly,
others.
Please.
They are already uncomfortable with a Russian-speaking Jew being elected president. And it is very possible that he's going to face domestic problems at home with an attempt at a third revolution if he tries to reconcile the war in East Ukraine, which he must do to provide some healing in the country.
Well, Crimea, of course, is a big issue for Ukrainians. So, Mr. Tangen, what do you think will be the agenda this president could handle?
Well, he's going to have to be creative, as you suggested, and that means that we're bringing about the end of the war, at least a standstill, something that can be held permanently. How he's going to do that and not violate territorial integrity, very difficult to see. But if he's creative, if he has a sense of humor, perhaps he can do it.
Really? A sense of humor? All right. I'll
Everything
bear
else
that words
hasn't
in mind. Okay. Einar Tangen, Mark Sloboda, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Certainly very different perspectives.